Rain hit the metal roof of the outpost like small stones falling from the sky. Daniel had never seen a storm this bad in all his years on this planet. The wind howled through the narrow valley outside, bending trees and tearing loose rocks from the cliffs. He sat by the small window of his outpost, watching lightning cut across the dark clouds, and he thought about how far away help was if anything went wrong tonight. Daniel was not a soldier or a hero. He was an engineer sent to this lonely frontier world to study old ruins left behind by a race long gone. Most days were quiet. He fixed machines, wrote reports, and walked the hills looking for pieces of broken stone with strange markings on them. But tonight was not quiet. Tonight, something in the storm called to him, though he could not explain why. He grabbed his coat and a flashlight, even though every part of his training told him to stay inside during a storm this strong. Something pulled him toward the cliffs near the old ruins, a feeling he could not shake. He walked out into the rain, his boots sinking into mud, the wind pushing hard against his back as if trying to send him away from whatever waited ahead. As he climbed higher along the rocky path, he heard a sound that did not belong to the storm. It was a low, pained cry, almost like a large animal in trouble. He followed the sound past broken trees and fallen stones until he reached a cliffside ledge. What he found there stopped him cold. A dragon nest, torn apart, lay scattered across the rocks. The mother dragon was dead, her body burned and cut in ways that told him this was not the storm's doing. Someone had killed her. Poachers, most likely, hunting for her scales to sell on the black market. Daniel had heard stories of such hunters passing through this region, but he never thought he would see the result of their cruelty with his own eyes. He knelt beside the broken nest, his heart heavy with anger and sadness. Then he noticed something moving beneath a pile of leaves and broken branches. 3 eggs, still whole, still warm despite the cold rain falling around them. He could feel a faint heartbeat through the shell when he placed his hand against one of them. Daniel knew the rules. Outpost workers were not allowed to interfere with local wildlife, especially not something as dangerous and rare as dragons. If anyone found out, he could lose his post or worse. But looking at those 3 eggs, alone in the storm with their mother gone, he could not make himself walk away. He gently wrapped them in his coat and carried them back down the mountain, the wind screaming around him the whole way. Back at the outpost, he worked through the night, building a makeshift incubator using spare parts from his equipment. He adjusted the heat carefully, worried he might get it wrong and lose them. He barely slept, checking on the eggs every hour, listening for any change. 2 days later, one of the eggs began to crack, then the second, then the third. What emerged were 3 small, trembling creatures, unlike anything Daniel had ever held in his hands. Their scales were soft and still forming, their wings folded tight against their tiny bodies, their eyes wide and searching for the mother they would never meet. They chirped and cried, confused by the strange metal room around them and the strange creature standing over them. Daniel did not know the first thing about raising dragons. He had only ever read about them in old reports and dusty books from the outpost library. But he understood fear when he saw it, and these 3 hatchlings were terrified. He spoke softly to them, the way he might speak to a frightened animal, and slowly, one by one, they crawled toward him instead of away. The boldest of the 3 pushed forward first, snapping playfully at his fingers, already showing signs of a fierce and fiery spirit. The second one hung back, watching everything with sharp, curious eyes, studying him carefully before deciding he was safe. The third, the smallest and gentlest of the group, simply climbed into his lap and fell asleep, as if it somehow already trusted him completely. Daniel sat there for a long time, watching the 3 hatchlings breathe softly in the dim light of his outpost. He knew he had just broken every rule he was supposed to follow. He knew that keeping dragons, even baby ones, was dangerous and forbidden. But as he looked down at the 3 small creatures who had lost their mother in one terrible night, he made a quiet promise to himself. He would protect them, whatever it cost him. He did not know yet how much that promise would shape the rest of his life, or how these 3 fragile hatchlings would one day grow into something far greater than he could imagine. All he knew, in that quiet moment after the storm, was that he was no longer alone on this lonely frontier world, and neither were they. Outside, the storm slowly passed, leaving behind a calm, star-filled sky. Inside the small outpost, Three dragon hatchlings slept peacefully for the first time since losing everything they had known, safe in the care of the one human who had chosen not to walk away. 6 months after the storm, the outpost no longer felt like a lonely research station. It felt like a home, though a strange and secret one. Daniel had turned a storage room into a hidden den for the three growing dragons, lining the floor with old blankets and scrap metal shaped into makeshift nests. What had once been a quiet place for reports and machine repairs was now filled with the sounds of small claws scratching on metal floors and playful roars that were still too weak to sound truly fierce. The three dragons had grown quickly, faster than Daniel expected. Their scales had hardened and taken on deep, rich colors, one shining red like fire, one a smoky gray that seemed to shift in the light, and one a soft green that reminded him of the forests back on his home planet. Each of them had grown into their own personality just as quickly as their bodies had grown. The red one was bold beyond reason, always testing the limits of what it could do. It climbed onto crates far too tall for it, jumped from ledges without thinking, and often came back to Daniel with small scrapes and bruises that healed within hours. Daniel found himself constantly chasing after it, pulling it down from dangerous heights, scolding it gently even as he could not help but admire its fearless spirit. The grey one was the opposite in almost every way. It watched before it acted, studied before it leaped. Daniel noticed early on that this one paid close attention to everything he did, from fixing broken equipment to cooking simple meals over a small fire. More than once, he caught it trying to copy his movements, using its claws in clumsy but determined attempts to mimic what it had seen him do. It was clear this one had a sharp mind hidden behind quiet eyes. The green one stayed close to Daniel almost every hour of the day. It followed him from room to room, curled up beside him when he worked, and seemed to sense his moods before he even understood them himself. When he was tired or worried, it would press its small head against his hand, staying still until he felt calm again. Of the three, this one had become his closest companion, bonded to him in a way that went beyond simple survival instinct. Raising three young dragons in secret was far harder than Daniel had imagined. Feeding them alone took most of his supplies, forcing him to hunt and forage more than his job required. He built stronger fences around the outpost, dug hidden tunnels for the dragons to move without being seen, and trained them, as best he could, to stay quiet and still whenever strangers came near. It was exhausting work for one man, but every night, when he saw them sleeping safely, he knew it was worth every difficult hour. The greater danger came from outside the outpost walls. Word had begun to spread through nearby villages of strange sounds coming from the ruins, of shadows moving too large to be normal animals. Some villagers whispered about dragons returning to the region, a thought that brought both fear and greed to different ears. Daniel heard rumors of hunters passing through, men who remembered stories of dragon scales worth more gold than a lifetime of honest work could earn. One evening, three armed men arrived at the edge of the outpost, claiming to be simple travelers looking for shelter from the cold. Daniel welcomed them cautiously, offering food and a place to rest, all while keeping careful watch on their eyes as they studied the outpost grounds. He noticed how their gaze lingered too long near the hidden storage room, how their questions about strange noises in the area came too easily, too practiced. He understood immediately what they truly were. That night, Daniel stayed awake, listening for any sound of movement near the hidden den. When he heard soft footsteps outside the storage room long after the travelers were meant to be asleep, he acted quickly, confronting the men before they could discover what lay behind the door. He used his knowledge of the outpost's old defense systems, tricking them into believing dangerous machinery guarded the area, warning them of deadly traps left behind by the previous inhabitants of the ruins. Frightened and unwilling to risk their lives for a rumor, the men left before sunrise, never learning the truth of what they had almost found. Daniel knew he could not keep relying on luck and clever tricks forever. The dragons were growing too large, too fast, to remain hidden much longer. Their wings, once small and folded uselessly against their backs, were beginning to stretch wide enough to catch the wind. Their roars, once weak, now echoed through the valley on quiet nights, no matter how carefully he tried to muffle the sound. Despite the growing danger, Daniel found himself more attached to the three dragons with each passing day. He had stopped thinking of them as creatures he was simply protecting out of duty or guilt. They had become his family, the closest thing to children he had ever known in his solitary life on this frontier world. He taught them, cared for them, and in turn, they trusted him completely, following his lead in everything they did. But deep down, Daniel understood that this quiet, hidden life could not last forever. The world outside the outpost was changing, and sooner or later, the secret he had kept for so long would need to change with it. For now, though, he allowed himself one more peaceful evening, watching his three dragons play together under a sky full of stars, grateful for every moment he had been given with them. A year had passed since the storm that changed Daniel's quiet life forever, and the outpost could no longer hide what it had become home to. The three dragons were no longer small creatures that could be tucked away in a hidden storage room. Their bodies had grown to the size of large horses, their wings now strong enough to lift them into the sky for short, clumsy flights that shook the ground when they landed. Daniel stood outside one morning, watching the red dragon attempt another wobbly flight across the valley, crashing into a pile of soft snow at the end of its short journey. He laughed despite himself, though the sound carried a weight of worry beneath it. Every day, the dragons grew stronger, louder, and harder to hide. Every day, the risk of discovery grew right along with them. He had already faced two more close calls in recent weeks, travelers who came too near the outpost, distant shapes in the sky spotted by villagers who now spoke openly of dragons living in the mountains once again. Daniel knew it was only a matter of time before someone with more skill and less fear than the last group of hunters came looking for proof of those rumors. That evening, he gathered the three dragons together in the open field behind the outpost, the same field where he had once buried the broken pieces of their mother's nest out of respect for what they had lost. He sat down in the grass, motioning for them to settle around him, the way he had done countless times before when he needed to speak with them about something important. The red dragon, always eager and restless, settled reluctantly, its tail flicking with impatience. The grey dragon watched him closely, already sensing that something serious was coming from the careful way Daniel folded his hands in his lap. The green dragon pressed close against his side, as if trying to stay near him for as long as possible before whatever news he had to share. Daniel spoke slowly, choosing his simple words with care. He told them, in the gentle way he always spoke to them, that they had grown too big and too strong to stay hidden any longer. He explained that the mountains beyond the outpost held the ancestral home of their kind, a place where they could grow freely without fear of hunters or angry villagers. He told them it was time for them to return to where they truly belonged. The reaction was immediate and painful to watch. The red dragon let out a sharp, angry cry, pushing against Daniel's side as if trying to argue without words. The grey dragon lowered its head, understanding the logic of his decision, but clearly unwilling to accept it easily. The green dragon simply pressed closer, refusing to move away from him, its soft eyes filled with something that looked almost like fear. Daniel felt his chest tighten with the weight of what he was doing. He had raised these three creatures from fragile eggs left alone in a storm. He had fed them, protected them, taught them everything he knew about surviving in a world that did not always welcome creatures like them. Letting them go felt like tearing away a piece of himself, but he knew, deep down, that keeping them any longer would only put them in greater danger. The next morning, Daniel led the three dragons up the winding mountain path toward the old ruins, the same ruins he had once studied as nothing more than broken stone and forgotten history. Now he understood those ruins held deeper meaning, remnants of a time when dragons and other ancient beings had lived freely across this land before newer settlers arrived and pushed them into hiding. At the highest point of the mountain, where the air grew thin and the wind carried the scent of open sky, Daniel stopped and turned to face his three companions one final time. He knelt down, placing a hand on each of their heads in turn, remembering the tiny, trembling hatchlings who had once crawled into his lap on the night they were born. He told them simply and honestly that they had never truly belonged to him. He explained that his job had only ever been to protect them until they could protect themselves, and that time had finally come. He promised them that no matter how far they flew, no matter how many years passed, the bond they shared would remain unbroken, carried quietly in each of their hearts. One by one, the three dragons stepped back from him, their wings unfolding fully for the first time in open air, ready for true flight rather than the clumsy hops of their younger days. The red dragon roared toward the sky before launching upward with surprising grace. The grey dragon followed close behind, already studying the wind currents with careful precision. The green dragon lingered the longest, pressing its head once more against Daniel's hand before finally rising into the air alongside its siblings. Daniel stood alone on the mountain, watching the three shapes grow smaller and smaller against the pale morning sky until they disappeared completely beyond the highest peaks. He felt tears on his face, though he made no effort to wipe them away. He had done what was right, even though it hurt more than he had expected. As he turned to walk back down the mountain toward his quiet, empty outpost, he carried with him a strange mixture of grief and pride. He did not know if he would ever see the three dragons again, but he hoped, more than anything, that the world he was returning them to would be kinder to them than the one that had taken their mother away. 20 years changed a man more than he ever expected, and it changed the world around him just as much. Daniel's hair had turned grey, his hands had grown slower with age, and the lonely outpost of his younger years now felt like a distant memory belonging to a different life entirely. He now lived within the walls of a small border kingdom called Vanhalt, a modest but proud land nestled between the mountains he once called home and the wider world beyond. He had come to Vanhalt many years earlier, offering his skills as an engineer to help repair old machines and strengthen the kingdom's defenses. Over time, his knowledge of forgotten technology and clever problem-solving earned him a place of quiet respect among the kingdom's people. He was not a nobleman or a soldier, but the young king often sought his advice on matters no one else understood, and the common folk simply called him the old outsider who had somehow always known more than he should. Daniel rarely spoke of the years he had spent raising 3 dragon hatchlings in secret. It felt like a story from another lifetime, one that ended the day he watched them fly away into the mountains without him. He told himself over the years that they had likely grown wild and free, living far from human affairs, perhaps even forgetting the man who once fed them by hand and kept them warm through cold nights. The peaceful life he had built in Vanhalt began to crumble one autumn morning when riders arrived at the castle gates, exhausted and covered in dust from days of hard travel. They brought grim news from the eastern border. A warlord named Draven Kest had gathered a massive army. Armed with old-world weapons, scavenged from ruins similar to the ones Daniel had once studied, and was marching steadily toward Vanhalt with intent to conquer. The young king, barely into his 3rd year of rule, gathered his advisors in the great hall, his face pale with worry despite his effort to appear calm before his people. Daniel stood among the small group of trusted advisors, listening carefully as reports described the size and strength of the approaching army. Draven Kest commanded thousands of soldiers, along with heavy siege engines capable of tearing through castle walls that had stood for generations. Vanhalt's own defenses were nowhere near strong enough to withstand such an assault. The kingdom's soldiers numbered only a few hundred, most of them farmers and craftsmen given weapons rather than trained warriors. Requests for aid sent to neighboring kingdoms returned with polite refusals, each ruler unwilling to risk their own soldiers for a small, struggling border territory they considered expendable. Daniel spent long nights in the castle workshop, using what old-world knowledge he still remembered to strengthen the kingdom's few remaining defenses. He reinforced gate mechanisms, repaired ancient alarm systems left over from a forgotten age, and taught the young soldiers what little he could about strategy and survival against a larger force. Yet even as he worked tirelessly, he understood deep down that his efforts alone would not be enough to save the kingdom from what was coming. The young king often visited the workshop late at night, seeking reassurance Daniel could not honestly give him. During one such visit, the king asked him plainly whether Vanhalt stood any true chance against Draven Kest's forces. Daniel considered lying to ease the young man's fear, but he had never been one for false comfort. He told the king honestly that without significant help, the kingdom's chances were slim, though he promised to do everything within his power until the very end. As the days passed and the warlord's army drew closer, reports grew increasingly bleak. Scouts described siege towers taller than the castle walls themselves, weapons capable of launching fire across great distances, and a warlord who showed no mercy to those who resisted his conquest. Villages along the eastern border had already fallen, their people either fled or forced into servitude under Draven Kest's growing empire. Daniel found himself standing alone on the castle walls one evening, watching the distant horizon where dark smoke rose from burning villages far in the distance. He thought about the life he had lived, the choices he had made, and the 3 dragons he had once raised and released so many years ago. He wondered, briefly and painfully, what might have been different if he had kept them close instead of letting them go, though he quickly reminded himself that such thoughts served no purpose now. He felt the full weight of his age settle over him that night, a tiredness that went beyond physical exhaustion. He had spent his life helping others, fixing broken things, protecting those who could not protect themselves. Yet now, faced with an enemy far greater than anything he had encountered before, he wondered if this time, his skills and knowledge simply would not be enough to make a difference. Still, Daniel refused to give up hope entirely. He returned to the workshop each day, continuing his preparations with quiet determination, encouraging the young soldiers around him even as doubt gnawed at his own heart. He organized supply lines, trained volunteers in basic defense tactics, and did everything within his power to give Vanhalt's people a fighting chance against the coming storm. As night fell over the kingdom once again, word arrived that Draven Kest's army had made camp only 2 days' march from Vanhalt's walls. The final battle was approaching quickly, and there seemed to be no escape from what was coming. Daniel stood at his window that night, looking out toward the distant mountains where he had once said goodbye to 3 young dragons, never imagining how desperately he might need them again. Smoke filled the horizon as Draven Kest's army finally reached the fields outside Vanhalt's walls, their numbers stretching so far across the land that the kingdom's soldiers could not see where the enemy lines ended. Siege towers rolled slowly forward on massive wheels, catapults were set into position, and rows of armored soldiers marched in perfect, terrifying formation toward the small kingdom's outer defenses. Daniel stood on the castle wall beside the young king, both men watching in grim silence as the enemy prepared for the final assault. The kingdom's few hundred defenders had taken their positions along the walls, farmers and craftsmen holding weapons with trembling hands, knowing full well the battle ahead was one they were unlikely to survive. Daniel had done everything within his power to prepare them, but staring at the massive force before them, he understood just how impossible their situation truly was. The first wave of attacks began at dawn, fire arrows raining down upon the outer wall, while siege engines launched heavy stones toward the ancient gates Daniel had spent weeks reinforcing. Explosions of dust and stone filled the air as the wall shuddered under the assault. Soldiers shouted orders, buckets of water were passed hand to fight the spreading fires, and the sound of battle horns echoed across the kingdom, calling every able body to the walls. Daniel fought alongside the defenders as best his aging body allowed, directing repair efforts and helping operate the old-world defense systems he had restored. Despite their best efforts, the outer wall began to crack under the relentless bombardment, and Daniel knew it was only a matter of time before Draven Kest's forces broke through completely. The young king, blood and dust covering his once fine armor, shouted encouragement to his exhausted soldiers, refusing to abandon his people even as hope seemed to slip further away with each passing hour. Then, as the sun climbed higher into the smoke-filled sky, a sound unlike anything heard on that battlefield before echoed across the valley. It began as a low rumble, growing steadily louder, causing both attacking soldiers and defending villagers alike to pause and look upward in confusion and fear. 3 massive shapes emerged from the distant mountains, their wings casting long shadows across the battlefield below as they descended toward Vanhalt with incredible speed. Daniel felt his breath catch in his throat as he stared upward, hardly daring to believe what his eyes were showing him. The dragons had grown enormous over the past 20 years, their bodies now larger than the siege towers that had threatened to break through the castle walls only moments before. The red dragon led the charge, its scales gleaming like burning fire in the morning light, roaring with a force that shook the very ground beneath the soldiers' feet. Draven Kest's army froze in confusion as the 3 massive dragons swept low over the battlefield, scattering soldiers who had never imagined facing such creatures in open combat. The red dragon crashed directly into the largest siege tower, tearing through wood and metal as easily as if it were paper, sending enemy archers scrambling for their lives as the structure collapsed beneath its powerful claws. The grey dragon moved with calculated precision, diving toward the catapults lined along the enemy's rear formation. With sharp, deliberate strikes, it destroyed each weapon one by one, using its intelligence to identify and eliminate the greatest threats first, exactly as it had once studied Daniel's careful, methodical movements so many years ago. Enemy soldiers who tried to defend the weapons found themselves quickly overwhelmed by the dragon's speed and precision. Green Dragon, gentlest of the three, took a different role entirely. Rather than attacking directly, it swept low over the fleeing villagers and wounded soldiers near the collapsing outer wall, using its massive wings to shield them from falling debris and enemy arrows. It carried injured defenders to safety within the inner courtyard, its careful, protective nature showing clearly even amid the chaos of battle, just as it had once curled protectively beside Daniel during quiet nights at the outpost. Draven Kest, watching his carefully planned assault collapse into chaos, attempted to rally his remaining forces from atop his personal war chariot, shouting orders that grew increasingly desperate as his soldiers began fleeing in terror from the dragon's relentless assault. Daniel watched from the castle wall, tears mixing with the dust and smoke covering his face, as he finally understood what had drawn the three creatures back after all these years. As if sensing the presence of the man who had once saved them, the red dragon turned mid-battle, its sharp eyes scanning the castle walls until they found Daniel standing among the defenders. For a brief moment, amid the roaring chaos of war, dragon and human locked eyes, 20 years of separation vanishing instantly in that single shared glance of recognition. The battle turned decisively within hours, Draven Kest's once mighty army broken and scattered across the fields surrounding Vanhalt. Soldiers who had marched confidently toward conquest now fled in terror, abandoning weapons and equipment as they retreated back toward the eastern border from where they had come. The warlord himself was forced to flee alongside his defeated forces, his ambitions of conquest crushed entirely by three dragons no one had expected to see again. As the last enemy soldiers disappeared over the distant hills, the three dragons circled once more above the battered but standing walls of Vanhalt before slowly descending toward the castle courtyard. Villagers and soldiers alike stepped back in awe and lingering fear as the massive creatures landed gently before the castle's steps, their enormous forms dwarfing everything around them, waiting patiently for the one person they had truly come to find. Silence fell over the castle courtyard as Daniel slowly made his way down the broken stone steps, his agging legs trembling slightly beneath him, though whether from exhaustion or emotion, he could not fully say. Around him, soldiers and villagers stood frozen in awe, none daring to move as the three enormous dragons watched the old man approach with careful, patient eyes. The red dragon lowered its massive head first, close enough that Daniel could feel warm breath against his weathered skin. He reached out a trembling hand, placing it gently against the dragon's scaled snout, the same way he had done countless times when it was small enough to fit in his arms. The dragon made a low, rumbling sound deep in its chest, something between a growl and a sigh, an unmistakable sound of recognition and relief. The grey dragon stepped forward next, tilting its head in the same curious, studying manner it had shown since it was a hatchling watching Daniel's every movement. Daniel smiled faintly, remembering all the times this one had copied his simple tasks with clumsy claws, determined to understand everything around it. Now fully grown, its sharp intelligence had clearly only deepened with age, evident in the calculated way it had dismantled the enemy's weapons only hours before. Finally, the green dragon approached, moving with the same gentle, protective nature it had always carried, even as a small, frightened hatchling curled in his lap on the night it hatched. It lowered its head until it rested softly against Daniel's chest, exactly as it used to do when he was troubled or tired at the old outpost. Daniel wrapped his arms around its great head as best he could, tears finally falling freely down his weathered face. The young king approached slowly, his expression a mixture of awe, confusion, and deep gratitude as he watched the emotional reunion unfold before him. He had heard whispers over the years of Daniel's mysterious past, quiet rumors about strange creatures and secrets from his younger days, but nothing could have prepared him for the truth now standing plainly before his eyes. When Daniel finally composed himself enough to speak, he turned to explain the truth to the young king and the gathered crowd. He told them simply about the storm many years ago, about finding 3 abandoned eggs after their mother had been killed by cruel hunters, and about the difficult choice he had made to raise them in secret before eventually letting them go free into the mountains where they truly belonged. The young king listened closely, clearly moved by the story, before asking Daniel the question that seemed to be on everyone's mind. He asked how Daniel had managed to tame such powerful, dangerous creatures, wondering what secret technique or hidden knowledge had allowed one man to command the loyalty of 3 full-grown dragons capable of turning the tide of an entire war. Daniel shook his head gently, correcting the young king's assumption with quiet certainty. He explained that he had never tamed the dragons, not once in all the years he had known them. Taming, he said, was about control born from fear, forcing obedience through strength or threat. What he shared with these 3 creatures was something entirely different, something built slowly through patience, kindness, and genuine care during their most vulnerable moments. He told the king and the gathered crowd that he had simply loved them when they needed it most, without expecting anything in return. He had fed them when they were hungry, protected them when they were afraid, and let them go when it was time, trusting they would find their own path in the world. That simple act of unconditional care, he explained, had created a bond far stronger and more lasting than any command or control ever could. The young king considered these words carefully, looking between the old man and the 3 magnificent dragons standing calmly beside him, clearly protective and loyal despite 20 years of separation. He realized, in that moment, a deeper truth about leadership and loyalty that no royal advisor or ancient text had ever fully taught him. True strength, he understood now, came not from fear or force, but from genuine care freely given to those who needed it most. In the weeks that followed, news of Vanhalt's miraculous victory spread quickly across neighboring kingdoms, along with stories of the 3 dragons who had saved an entire kingdom out of loyalty to the man who had once saved them. Rather than fear returning to the region, a new sense of wonder and respect grew among the people, who now viewed dragons not as monsters to be hunted, but as noble creatures capable of great loyalty and compassion. The 3 dragons chose to remain near Vanhalt after the battle, making their home once again in the nearby mountains, close enough to visit Daniel regularly in his final years. The young king, wise enough to recognize the value of such an alliance, declared the mountains a protected sanctuary, forbidding any hunting or harm to come to dragons within the kingdom's borders, a law that would remain unbroken for generations to come. Daniel spent his remaining years in peace, watching Vanhalt grow stronger and more prosperous under the young king's now wiser rule, always with 3 enormous, loyal guardians watching over the kingdom from the mountains above. He often told visitors who asked about his remarkable story that the greatest lesson he had ever learned was simple enough for anyone to understand. Kindness, given freely and without condition, could grow into something powerful enough to change the fate of an entire kingdom. And that lesson, born from one small act of compassion during a storm many years ago, would echo through Vanhalt's history for as long as its people remembered the old man and his 3 dragons.